Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. This is the medical device playbook for September 23rd. We have a really interesting presentation here today for you. Two of our speakers who've both taken early stage startup companies and gone all the way through IPO at least once. And they're going to share a lot of the decisions they made and all the challenges they faced. Should be super interesting. We'll get into the introductions in a moment. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the context of this whole event. What is a medical device playbook if you haven't been to one before? Where this actually started was about 6 or 7 years ago with conferences in Vancouver and Toronto in person. We brought speakers. The general philosophy was to bring speakers in from other places. Everybody has already heard all the stories in the town where they are. So we wanted to bring in speakers from other places and really connect the industry and allow people to be inspired about entrepreneurship. And over time, the event really coalesced into being about medical device entrepreneurship and sort of the core skills and capabilities that were unique to the space. So, and we've had many inspiring speakers. It's been a total privilege to be able to bring this to an audience. Then what happened is that COVID happened, and then we no longer had the opportunity to hold the events live. Getting some loud noises from somewhere. I'm not sure who's got a background going. Steve Plymale, maybe? Can you mute? So COVID came and we had to do our events virtually, and we started doing them every month. And it became actually about twice as popular as it ever was live in terms of participants. And we broadened to add a lot more people. So it's actually been super fun to participate. And we have an event every month. Next month in October, we have an event on people who've gone from being a grad student all the way to being successful entrepreneurs. We have entrepreneurs from around North America talk about that. So that's generally what Playbook is. We will be going live again, probably next year, and so that should be pretty fun. Tiny bit of context on StarFish. This event is not promotional by any means, but you might want to understand generally what it is that we do as a company. We're a product development services company with about 170 staff members now, based primarily in Victoria and Toronto, serving the North American market. We tend to work for a variety of companies, startups, public companies, corporates, mostly in North America. And what we specialize in is complex electromechanical devices. We care a lot about human factors. We care a lot about getting the technology right. We care a lot about margins. Mostly what we care about is having companies successfully achieve their goals, get to successful exits or successful IPOs, whatever. So that's the context of today. You may wonder why a product design company would be hosting a webinar to do with IPOs. We're not a banker. We're not trying to raise money for you, but we love it when you're successful. So, and with that, I would like to just jump right into the content. And our first speaker today is Francois Michelon, who's an American of French ancestry. He'll get back into some of that. That's the interesting name. He's got a fantastic global corporate background from GE, Smith & Nephew, Biomet, and ENDRA. Now ENDRA. One of these four is not like the other three, you may have noticed. And he'll tell you all about that and how he was able to make that transition. And his background is global marketing, group director, and global marketing again with Biomet. So that's kind of the sort of the business viewpoint that he brings to the startup environment. And so with that, I would like to just pass the floor over to Francois, and he'll tell us about that whole story. And if you do have any questions, just a moment. Thank you, Francois. Just the last thing, if you do have questions you like us in the Q&A section after both speakers, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to enter it in there and we'll be running a Q&A. Okay, now it's over to you, Francois.
Hey, thanks, Scott, and the whole StarFish team, and to everyone who's joined us here today. It's flattering and a pleasure to share what is more of a personal journey and a short slide deck at that than a, I would say, capital formation playbook. But I hope, without being paternalistic in any way, that some of the struggles and the successes and things that I've learned along the way are of interest to you. And I look forward to a rich discussion after Steve and I give our presentations. personal snapshot, as Scott mentioned, born in the US to French parents, split my time growing up between Europe here in the US. Non-technical background, undergrad in economics and MBA, married and have 2 children. And the views expressed here, which is going to give you a sense of what being a public company CEO does to you, is I have to disclose that this is not the opinion of my employer. This is just my personal view on what happened along this journey. I hope that's of interest to everyone. So let me perhaps contextualize, as I earned my stripes, what I did, and I think Scott touched on this. I spent, almost 2 decades going up through the ranks of large healthcare technologies companies like GE Healthcare, Smith & Nephew, and Biomet. And I think in that regard, for a young post-MBA manager, a lot of value in terms of learning some of the functional skills in finance, managing a P&L, operations, marketing, HR, things that could translate with value and maturity to a startup environment. But I also, as I think many of us in those environments, pick up some bad habits, some entitlements that I make it hard to transition to a real startup. And I was pretty naive to that and to that baggage when I was forced to pivot, as they say, for lack of a better euphemism. And you get used to a really well-resourced environment. The refrigerator is always stocked. There's someone to your left or to your right who can give you advice on how it was done last year. And you get used to a decision-making process that is, I would say, heavier, perhaps at times slower, and perhaps more dependent on matrix, hierarchy, and data than I think you have the luxury for in a startup environment. And I wouldn't say that this is always the case, but in my experience, even at these leading companies, innovation remains somewhat iterative. You're not taking something from nothing to first in kind. You're taking an ultrasound system to the next level, or an orthopedic implant to the next level. And again, nothing wrong with that, but again, very distinct from a startup environment. In 2014, I was divisional head of marketing for a division of Biomet, and we were acquired by a competitor. And so approaching 50, I was, as the British say, put out on gardening leave. And that was very, very hard, as perhaps some of you have experienced. You're scared, you're doubting yourself, you're not sure what you want to get into. And the process for me took close to a year. And I had opportunities to get back into a corporate environment fairly soon, but they just didn't feel right. And truthfully, I didn't quite know what I was looking for. I had a decent severance, and I had a bit of a luxury to take some time and find something that felt right. And, as luck would have it, you often hear it's sort of in the least expected way. You stumble across and you network into an opportunity. And that opportunity was ENDRA Life Sciences, which at the time had about 4 employees. It had some very smart people on the board, including the chair of radiology at Stanford and several other people who are still with us. But it was tiny, it was undercapitalized, and yet it had some very interesting intellectual property and technology. And I think I was very naive about what the next few years would entail, but it felt fresh. It felt like there was something that could be built. And it also felt to me as, look, this is probably one of the only times you're going to be able to make this decision. You wouldn't have naturally left a good corporate job to take a risk like this, but now you're in a position where you can make that decision. And frankly, if it fails, you could go back to a corporate environment. So I jumped in, and as background, ENDRA has some interesting technology in photo and thermoacoustic enhanced ultrasound using different energy sources, infrared light or radio frequency, to generate sound waves in tissue in a way that are different than traditional ultrasound, and enabling characterization of tissue composition, state, and function in a way that's similar to MRI, but at the point of care, and obviously at a much, much lower cost. And an example of that is what you see on the right, which is a representation of our interpretation of the temperature change signal during a thermoablative procedure of tissue overlaid in real time on a traditional ultrasound. And so these would be catheters, needles inserted with either microwave, radiofrequency, or cryotherapy energy to ablate cancer, dull a nerve for pain, or affect heart tissue for cardiology. And so being able to show a interventional radiologist, cardiologist, oncologist where that therapy is landing in the tissue in real time, which cannot be done except on an MRI today, is, we think, unique, and one of the clinical applications we hope to develop over our roadmap. So I hope that helps give you a sense of what we're focused on. So I joined the company, and this is me in my ENDRA t-shirt, not at that point in time, but it represents the enthusiasm I had. This is, going to be great. I'm joining a startup. I've got all these great skills picked up from blue chip companies, and it's all going to translate, and I'm going to work hard, and it's going to be just a lot of fun. And as I may say, and pardon me, Scott, it was a shit show for the next 2 years. It was the hardest period of my life. I was incredibly naive about what I got into. And, I have some snapshots here. I mean, both in terms of, I did a count. I think I did over 1,000 presentations to investors of all kinds and bankers, high net worth individuals, VCs. We explored reverse mergers. I think there was a uranium mine in Canada that had a shell that we could have used to gone public. I mean, there were a number of paths to getting funded, and got a lot of no's. In fact, it got entirely no's until it changed. But you don't know. It's a little bit like selling your house. You get a lot of people coming, looking, and it doesn't happen. And eventually it does happen, you hope. But 2 years is a very long time. At the time, and I still think to some degree today, biotech, software, AI versus medtech had a different appetite in the investment community. And so I think we were a little more challenged. We were very early in the process, still very much in development, and that did not help us. And, to make it worse for me, I mean, I really believed in this company. I invested a large share of my personal savings. I, for a long period, did not take a paycheck. And, this is looking really dire. Culturally, I was also locked in this very small company with a very, very smart, very previously successful founder who was looking at me like, who are you, Johnny come lately corporate guy with your PowerPoint? And he was frustrated with me, with the situation, and we were butting heads. And I needed him a lot more than he needed me. And that made it hard every day. You come back to what is it really like? It's 4 employees. You're trying to keep the lights on, and you're on the road at the time when we could travel, staying in absolutely horrible motels and hotels, and flying, cheapest that you can. And there's no playbook. There are things you can read about, but at the end of the day, you've got to figure it out or you go home. And it was just incredibly hard. And I don't say this to be dramatic. It really felt for 2 years like we were investing an enormous amount of time and energy and not making any traction. I was completely new to public capital formation, and somehow, frankly, I don't remember the specific moment in time, but we coalesced enough smart people to say, I think there's an IPO in here. And we secured bankers, which I'll speak to in a second, who said we could do this. And we went through this both, technically very complicated, high risk and rigorous process. But I will say on a positive note, it was really interesting. I was approaching 50, as I said. I'd never done an IPO. I'd managed, important P&Ls at these other companies, but writing an S1, leading diligence, going on investor roadshow, all new. And despite the workload and the frustration, very energizing to me at the same time that I was learning something new. So one thing that I hope I can engender on the audience is that there are a lot of investment banks chasing deals. And in the microcap space, my experience has been before the IPO and following, a lot will try, a lot will say they can do it. And assuming you've gotten through all of those or many of those 150 aforementioned steps, you're in the home stretch with an investor roadshow. And what I want everyone to take away from this is there are some good bankers out there, but there are a lot who overstate their abilities, in my experience. And it's hard to get a deal done. And you're not the only deal in town. And so this is something I've certainly experienced and I think will resonate with people who've gone through this. You're in the home stretch. You're on the roadshow. You're pitching 5, 10 people a day. The book of investors and their commitments is building, and you're asking along the way at day 5, how's it looking? At day 10, at day 20, it's going great, is what you hear. And the day of the pricing of your deal, you will, in my experience, also potentially hear it's going great. And 4 hours later, after the close of markets, you're in the pricing meeting, and you may hear, and despite all the work that you've put in, we don't have a deal. 6 hours earlier, you had a deal. Now you don't. And you may hear a number of excuses or reasons. The market changed. There were other deals pricing that evening. The anchor investor pulled out. Who knows? And by the way, you still owe our expenses and legal fees. But I say this because, one, in hindsight, I don't think I did enough background checking on these household names in terms of investment banks, and they were reputable in some areas, but they may not have done an IPO in my area from my stage of a company. And I think really asking those questions up front, show us your track record for a company like ours in our space at our stage of development. And let me talk to some people that you've helped get across the goal line. And I hope this doesn't sound patronizing, but this happened to me and it surprised me, because the momentum you build through the IPO preparation process, all the way through the investor roadshow to then an anticlimactic end, surprised me. So it's not done till it's done. I said it, 2 years feels incredibly long, but you only need the coalescence of a few things, including a good banker, to get it across the goal line. And in our case, I think going public 3 to 4 years ahead of commercialization was a tough putt for many people. It's a trade-off. I'll talk about that later. But I don't think we were setting out to do an IPO from the very beginning. I think private funding would have been a more natural way for us to incubate ourselves, develop the technology, and have a bigger IPO. But we got this done. It was a straight IPO on the capital markets. It was not a large IPO, but based on our bank account, it was a windfall and allowed us and was a springboard for us to go forward and to achieve some things I'm very proud of. That's my wife on the left of the page there in the beige, and she's clapping because she's happy that we don't have to sell our house or one of our kidneys to keep the kids in school. But it was a great day for us, and I would try to preemptively answer, what helped? Yeah, the passion and the persistence of the team, of course. I like to think I had something to do with it. Our founder, Mike Thornton, who I call out by name here, still with us. He and I now have a deep, respectful relationship, or at least I think so. And it was forged by this pressure to succeed. And we saw where his deep technical knowledge was complemented by my, I hope, commercial experience. And we complemented each other, and we continue to work together to this day. Our CFO, of course, and our families. But I call out that great banker. I highlighted the lack thereof very often of, I would say, high quality, capable bankers. But we found one, Jonathan Rich, who I called out here on our presentation by National, who's been subsequently acquired by B. Riley. He had said no to me a year prior. He said, "We have other priorities. We don't think you're ready." And I stayed at it. A year later, I came back to him. I said, we're still at it. Here's the progress we've made. And he said, "I think I can do the deal." And I think that's a great little story, because I think he's one of the best bankers I've ever met, and he didn't overcommit. And 3 weeks after that, we had coalesced a deal. I'd also say that good lawyers, in my mind, had never been so obviously critical as in this public capital formation, not only from the execution of the paperwork, but our lawyers, K&L Gates, they took a lot of risks to help us in terms of doing work and assuming we would get funded and pay them. And I would say they were real partners in this, and they really knew our business. And as a result, they stay our counsel, and we continue to count on them. But they really helped us. I think our pitch got better naturally over time. I hope so. And I can't minimize the fact that luck always plays a part. I want to highlight, though, that smart people and great ideas fail every day. And we were, on the bubble for almost 2 years. And yeah, it's nice in hindsight to sound heroic and entrepreneurial and say, "Oh, I believed in this and my persistence was really what it took." But I also admit that it wasn't always rational. And I think that's a risk. There was ego involved. Did I believe in the technology? Yes. Do I still believe in it? Yes. But that ego of, damn it, I'm going to get this done, as well as a bit of sunk cost mentality and momentum, is dangerous. And you can genuinely end up divorced and homeless if that goes on too long. So I call that out because in hindsight, it was probably an inch away from failure, and yet we got it done. Getting investors to join you in this journey is a lot harder, in my experience, than what I'd experienced of battling it out in the GE annual budget and healthcare process. And knowing your audience is key as well. I hope that doesn't sound patronizing, but for me, it was brand new, and I was brought into a retail broker trading floor by the bankers and said, "Hey, you got 10 minutes. You've got CNBC blaring on the TVs. You got these hardworking men and women in the trading pit looking at you, and they give you a microphone, and you don't have a slide deck, and you've literally got 10 minutes before the market opens. You got to scream with confidence and hopefully clarity. What are the key points you want these men and women to relay to their customers? There's no fancy GE presentation on the market opportunity. You've got to convince them that way. And that happened to me several times. Conversely, institutional investors, much more of a, I would say stereotypical presentation with science, financials, market analysis. But I wasted time without knowing it from several institutional investors who, were diligencing us about our technology for their other investments. And that's hard to tease out. They have other interests in your space. They want to learn about you. And it's not done, illegally. It's done very much, as part of the process, but you got to know when they're tire kickers. And I know them or smell them out a little bit more now. I didn't know that then. I'd also say that a good investor relations firm is helpful before, but essential after. And we've gone through a few. We've been working with LHA, Keith Lippert and Associates in New York, for a while now. And their role is to help you, obviously, manage the incoming investor questions, but also help you with messaging, with the logistics, and introduce you to new potential investors. And we found that having a good investor relations firm is very helpful, I would say, especially after the IPO. So as I come into the home stretch here, we got the IPO done. I think we've done some really interesting things, but to put it in perspective, we started with 4 people, we grew to about 10. Today, we're at around 30 staff. In 2017, as a nod to Scott and StarFish, we decided as a small company, we want to partner with people who do this for a living. And so we partnered with StarFish as part of our asset-light development model. Rather than hiring 30 more engineers to design a power supply, Scott has very smart people who've been doing this, and I can work with him on a services basis. This is not a commercial plug for him, but I want you to understand our business model and how Scott and StarFish has fit into that, and it's been super. And since then, we've completed the product. We've completed a first-in-human feasibility study. We've got our CE regulatory mark, and COVID permitting, we're commercializing our first product as we speak. So, it's been very interesting for us. I was incredibly naive in hindsight coming into this. And would I do it again? The answer is a really unqualified yes. As a now 55-year-old, I work harder every day than I ever did in a corporate setting, but I'm constantly learning. And for me, the capital formation or public company governance or technical development at the scale of a startup is so energizing that I would rather run the risk of failing in a startup environment than just be a pawn in a corporate setting. And so that learning to me is highly energizing. Certainly, you develop confidence. I wouldn't say I'm overly confident, but I've faced so many existential threats in this process that I feel like you step back, you develop an emotional maturity, and you deal with it. And that works. I think I've touched on the innovation. The relationships I've developed are deep, including with our founder. And being public has helped us raise capital because of the liquidity, because of the trading currency of your company. It's allowed us to raise capital when there have been some tough market cycles, and colleagues of mine who are running similar companies in the private sector have really felt the crunch there. And we've been very careful about how much capital we've raised, and we've thankfully got no debt on our balance sheet, but it gives us options. It's optionality for us. I will also say that it's been a trade-off. Being a public company 3 years ahead of revenue takes a lot of time and money, right? Auditors, lawyers, SEC filings, quarterly earnings calls, audit committee meetings. That's a lot of my time and a lot of our board's time and a lot of resources that could have been allocated to technology development or something else. So it's a trade-off. Net, I'm glad we did it. I think we made great progress, but I hope I've shown some of the pros and cons. And again, thank you, Scott, for inviting me, and thank you to the audience for listening to me, and back to you.
Great. Well, that's super great. Thanks so much, Francois. I totally enjoyed listening to your presentation, and wonderful, honest insights. That's, I think, maybe what distinguishes Playbook from some other events. This is the real warts and all kind of story. So thank you all for who put in questions. The Q&A tab is mostly where we'll look. If you put them in the chat by accident, and I will look over there as well. I'll be moderating the Q&A after. So. Well, let's move on. Let's move on to our next speaker, who is Steve Plymale, wonderful guy based in Toronto-ish. He's sort of Montreal, sort of Toronto. I'm not exactly sure where he is just at the moment. And so Steve has got such a remarkable background. It's so interesting to see where CEOs come from, what channel of expertise. So he'd be a little hard to pin down. He's been executive in customer service, in business development, quality, which usually doesn't come after business development, but in his case it does somehow, and he'll tell us why, I'm sure. Clinical services, and then finally VP, GM, and CEO. So, and he's done that for companies like ISG, Sidera Software, CryoCast, you may recall, which sold to Medtronic, a wonderful startup in Montreal area, and Claron Technology, Xltek, which sold to Natus, which you may mention something about that. Profound Medical, which actually did an IPO, MyndTec, and now he has his own consulting company. So with that, I will pass over to Steve, and we'd love to hear your stories.
Well, thanks so much, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to share my story. And it's compelling to hear how similar many aspects of it is to Francois' story. So you'll see some of the similar themes. But I'm going to take you back through my journey over the last couple of years, starting with this moment, a hallmark of our career.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
If that's the one.
5.
So you can get you to the next slide here. There you go.
Yeah. Well, I consider myself a medical device guy in all the companies that Scott mentioned in my past. You'll see a little bit more about those in the next slide, but I consider myself to be kind of a seasoned medical device guy that's been through all the functional areas of these companies. In terms of my background, I'm now in the middle of Montreal and Toronto in a place called Wolf Island, where my wife and I are empty nesters. We have 6 boys who are kind of divided between the 2 places, and so we've settled into a kinder, gentler life in the pandemic times, and sort of replaced the savages with 2 cats and a dog. And I still work on helping companies grow. The theme has been for me in my career, basically trying to help people solve problems. At the same time, I have developed a passion for corporate governance, and sit on a couple of boards today, and continue to focus on helping the life sciences industry wherever I can. So let's see if I can figure out which button is going to move this. There we go. In terms of the last 20 years, Scott mentioned CryoCast, which was an excellent story, notable in that it was a PMA level endeavor led by Steve Arliss, so an amazing entrepreneur. That segued into an opportunity with a company called Xltek, which had just gone public, another company in the neurology field. Within about 6 months of arriving, they were acquired by Natus Medical, and really Xltek led the neurology division, which was an amazing ride. I call it a very aggressive growth period. And it was the experience at Natus and the contrast of being with a large, aggressively growing company to the opposite end of the spectrum with Profound Medical. Along the way, with my passion for corporate governance, I was invited to join the board as an independent director at Profound Medical. And in 2011, shortly after they received commitments on a Series A, I stepped in as the CEO with 6 employees and a couple of $1 million in the bank, and off we went. I'm going to focus my story today mostly on that ride because it did lead to a going public strategy, and I think there's a lot to talk about. But it also led me back to, after a brief break, another startup called MyndTec, which is finally trying to have its breakout moment. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of my presentation. And hopefully the next chapter with a new company called Natus Medical. This is a company based in Europe and has some exciting opportunities for my career to continue to grow in assisting them with their growth. Oops. Let me go back one slide and talk a little bit about the Natus bullet ride. When I met Jim Hawkins, who was the CEO in 2007, Natus was about a $300 million company. They had acquired Xltek for around $57 million. And immediately we had gone to the Natus playbook for growing the company. It was a rigorous exercise that took about 12 months. It included, over the next 4 years, 4 acquisitions. It was a growth by acquisition strategy that also led to rapid growth in our top line revenue. And it could only be described as a bullet train. Quite often we would acquire a company, take the assets of the company, the product portfolio, but leave the people behind. And after 4 years of growing a company through sort of the teardown of existing companies, I decided to move on to an alternative scenario, and that was the Profound experience. It was completely the other end of the spectrum. They had a prototype on the bench with very promising IP. They had 6 employees, none of whom had ever really worked in a commercial company. They were all coming right out of the lab. We had a tranched Series A, so we had the first sort of batch of money, but it was based on hitting our milestones to create an operational plan, a regulatory strategy, figure out the solution around reimbursement earlier than later, validate the technology clinically, both technically and clinically, and along the way, keep gas in the tank. So we needed to start strategizing our funding sources. And you know, that was challenging at best in terms of our plan and the amount of runway. It all started with a very compelling day for me when I was invited to go over to Sunnybrook Research, where the technology was developed, and actually watch them put a man with prostate cancer in an MRI scanner and treat them with their prototype device. And you know, in 40 minutes, they had been able to ablate virtually all of this man's prostate with millimeter precision without an incision. And a year later, the man proved to bear out that he was cancer-free. And the story was very compelling. We had the benefit of some very strong VC backers. And for sure, we could not have done what we did without the solid commitment of early VCs like Genesis Capital and the BDC. We had a long road from a benchtop device that was literally Velcroed together to a preclinical phase, which was very successful. Having reached that milestone, we were able to get our next phase of money in the next tranche, and went on to do our phase 1 clinical study, which also was very successful. And then on to a pivotal trial, which initially started in support of a PMA regulatory strategy, which, as you may know, as medical device folks, is a fairly steep climb and a very expensive proposition, especially when your technology includes an MRI scanner and biopsies and one-year follow-ups. Nevertheless, we were able to negotiate with the FDA and other regulatory bodies on a strategy that reduced that burden from a PMA to initially a de novo and then ultimately a 510K, which was achieved after the clinical trial was successfully concluded. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the technology, just again to give you some insights as to what was so compelling about it. This is a device that is used under MRI guidance. It is used in real time with closed loop imaging. We actually take the temperature that is embedded in the image data as thermography information, and it's fed back into our device. The device is actually a probe which is inserted into the urethra and down into the prostate. We image it with multiple cross-sectional slices, and then we define a boundary of the gland, the prostate gland. And what you're seeing here is us actually in real time ablating the tissue from the inside out, and doing so with millimeter precision, which allowed us to minimize the potential risks around nerve damage and other damage that would cause side effects such as incontinence and loss of sexual function. And again, it's a very groundbreaking technology, one that has been embraced by clinicians throughout the world and continues to be breaking new ground with new clinical applications that Profound is pursuing with the foundational technology that was developed. You know, the amazing thing about it was that from an IPO perspective, my audience in general turned out to be the average 65-year-old finance guy. And our statistics were 1 in 7. And I can't tell you the number of times that I had someone discreetly come up to me after my pitch and tell me that he's the guy, he's the 1 in 7, and that he wished he had seen this technology before he had surgery or an alternative procedure. So it was very rewarding to be able to, you know, promote a technology that was having such a positive impact on the men's healthcare. But ultimately, you get to the point where you run out of gas in that tank, and that was happening to us in 2014. And we, at the time, had already developed a fairly robust strategy to develop a Series B. But we were getting very concerned about, you know, who was coming to the table. It seemed to take longer, and folks, it always takes longer. And we were quite concerned about the follow through on our strategic partnerships who were bringing money to the table, new VCs, and even people who were offering us debt financing. And we have to say that at the same time, when news sort of got out there that we were pitching a private B round of about 15 to 20 million, the bankers arrived. And I would say it was a bit of a beauty contest. Many of the bankers that Francois sort of referred to have the capacity to do successful microcap issuing, and they were aggressively courting us to take us on the road. And ultimately, after an exhaustive process of evaluating who would be the right partner, we selected a bank and a syndicate and went out on the promise of, it'll take a couple of months, we'll do 25 meetings, 8 people will take their checkbook out and write you a $3 million check, and we'll move on with a $25 million raise. Needless to say, a year later, I had pitched everywhere, and it indeed is not an elevator pitch until you're in New York, in a tower, with about 90 seconds of an elevator ride and an iPad in your hand. And it's not an elevator pitch till you do it in an elevator. And I can say that I had the privilege. I counted, and I had 216 no's before we got to the pivotal presentation to an investor who had just recently sold his company for $3.2 billion. And on slide 8, I saw the light bulb go off over his head, and he said, we got to do this. So up until that time, I had heard every form of no that you could possibly imagine. You're too early, it's too complex, you need reimbursement first, you're too Canadian. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But nevertheless, we persevered, and it is the hallmark of successful executives that get to the goal line because of sheer perseverance. We ended up raising 28 million with the go public transaction. It was one of the most complex transactions in 2015 on the Toronto Venture Exchange. It included a reverse into a CPC, a capital pool company. It included debt. It included a distribution deal, and it took quite a while to close, to the point where we were really concerned about whether we were going to make it. And in fact, had it not been for a bridge financing with our existing VCs, we would not have made it. So that, you know, success breeds success. And a year later, we actually had the same bankers and the same syndicate come back with a $17.5 million bought deal, which continued to fund lots of growth. We went from 6 people to 25 people. We went public with around 25 people, and then quickly ballooned in growth. I think we got it up to about 60 employees. Let me just get this next slide. I don't know why it's not working. There we go. So we went from this, where we started out with no money, to a real booth, real growth. We went from a 4,000 square foot facility to about 40,000 square feet. That allowed us to bring in our manufacturing capacity, grow the team, do real research and development in labs. And it really was an amazing time of growth. A lot of my personal time really went into maintaining the need to focus on strategic partnerships. We, at the time, were trying to pitch Siemens against Phillips and Phillips against Siemens to make sure that you know, both of them really wanted to engage in partnerships with us. This is a picture of us getting our first real strategic deal with Siemens Medical. And that kind of spurred on some additional success in getting the clinical partnerships that we needed. We ended up doing a pivotal trial with, I think, about a dozen clinical sites. We scaled up our ability to manufacture our device. It was a very complex device to make. And, you know, 2011 to 2015 was an amazing period of growth. Again, we went to about 60 people, and I'm privileged to say that about 17 of those people actually worked for me in previous companies. I took a year off in 2017, having traveled about 2 million miles to try to get that clinical trial going. We ended up signing on all of the sites we needed, and I ended up stepping away and taking a break. And then thinking about my next chapter, I also had the same dilemma that Francois did. I felt I had another one in me. And indeed, MyndTec was an opportunity to see another new technology in rehabilitative medicine that I found very compelling. And this is a company also exploring a pathway to potentially going public, but doing it in a completely different manner from the way we did it at Profound. And I guess it really just highlights the point that there are a number of different ways to do this. This method that I'm talking about is a direct listing with a private placement that's completed prior to the go public transaction, and then using what's called a non-offering prospectus. It's a much simpler and straightforward process, but perhaps one that carries different risks given the lack of an underwriter and banker. So, you know, it's a completely different prospect. Nevertheless, you know, there are a lot of different ways to do this. You know, you're hearing about the SPAC explosion in the US, and there are many bankers who will gladly take you down that route. You really do need to be careful about who you partner with and their capacity to take you across the goal line. You know, a lot of people ask, why do you go public? And, you know, more often than not, the answer is to raise funds. And it's always an answer that is linked to raising capital. And I think it's an easy answer, but it's probably the wrong answer. Because on the other side of going public, you have to do one thing successfully. You have to trade. And to Francois's point, you need a strategy. You need a strategy around investor relations. You need a strategy on how you're going to manage your milestones, your news flow, your exit strategy, if you have one. You need to disclose everything. And it is a transparency that ultimately drives you to you know, be very, very disciplined in how you talk to investors and the general public for that matter. And you have to be consistent. The markets reward companies that do what they say they're going to do. And if you have to change your plan, you need to be transparent about it. You need, if you have to pivot, to explain to the markets, you know, why you're doing it, what's your rationale, and how it's going to help you achieve your goals of increasing your value and rewarding your investors for their commitment to you. So I guess just to round this out, you know, there's a lot of things to think about why you might want to become a public issuer. Yes, it's a lot about raising capital because you'll get a premium on your valuation, and it may make raising funds somewhat easier, but there's a lot of overhead that goes with it, not only on the corporate level, but also on the personal level. You will spend a lot of time managing investors, regardless if they are exclusively institutional or retail. There are many different methods to do this, and I won't get into the details any further than I have already. I'm happy to answer questions. You do need support, and I would highlight, as did Francois, the need for a really good legal team and a really good auditor group that you can rely on. And you need to really evaluate what the risks and benefits are versus a private strategy. And ultimately, once you make your commitment, you have to go for it. You have to persevere, and it does take quite a bit of commitment. So that's my pitch to you, and I hope I've shared enough information to spark some interest, and I'm happy to answer some questions, Scott.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. So I see the Q&A tab is starting to fill up. Feel free to toss a few more questions in there as we go, and I'll do my best to try to balance. And Francois, if you could turn your camera and your microphone back on again. Wow, those are two fantastic presentations. Exactly hit the right tone of being open. This is not the Chamber of Commerce kind of thing about how you're a genius and every decision you ever made was brilliant. We all know that we're just humans, but these are two particular amazing humans, but even so, just humans. And so maybe, I know there are a bunch of questions digging into the more specifics of how did you choose the specific public path. We call this event IPO. We all know that's a proxy for a lot more complex structures that are available in the public markets. And then how did you pick your banker? And I think those are probably related because the bankers probably helped you guide you through those. So maybe we'll start with Francois.
Yeah, thanks. I would love to tell you, hey, we strategically looked at all our options and we picked the IPO, and that's what we wanted to do, and we did it. Now, I think it was scattershot, as I touched on. We were looking for funding. We were looking at any source of funding that was palatable, and we weren't successful, or we turned down, I would say, unpalatable options until we got the IPO done across the goal line. In hindsight, as I mentioned, I think I would have probably, if I'd been in complete control, stayed private a little bit longer, matured the technology, and then had a bigger, higher valuation IPO. But that's not what happened. We were literally trying to stay alive. So it's not, I would say, as smart per se, as someone who kind of really focuses on that as the goal. In terms of how we picked a banker, one, as I said, there's a mixed bag in any industry. You're going to have good people, not so good people, and then there's fit with your profile of the company. And we dealt with some, on paper, very qualified bankers who just were not a good fit. And I wasn't strict enough about that, not from negligence, but because I didn't really know any better. And these people have reputation. They have a well-known shingle. They're multi-billion-dollar under management. So, they've got all the trappings of someone who's done this. And yet, when you look at it, they may not have done a deal of your kind, your size, because a $10 million deal for us is roughly the same amount of work for a banker as a $100 million deal. And some of the people who want to do the $100 million deal don't want to do a $10 million deal. It's not enough for them. So for us, at the end of the day, I think, doing your diligence, asking for references, but, kind of figuring out from their portfolio who they've helped that look a lot like you. And then there's a certain amount of, hiring intuition about, is this person selling you realistically? Are they telling you they can raise any amount of money? I think that's a bad sign. Are they telling you, I think we can realistically raise this, and I think it's going to be with this type of investor? In our case, largely retail investors, very few institutional investors. That adds a lot of volatility, but in our case, thankfully, our banker was able to get it into the hands of high quality retail investors who were well managed by their brokers, and therefore we're not in this for a 3% profit in 6 weeks selling your stock after the IPO. So, all of those lessons learned. I don't know if there's a perfect framework for screening these people, but that was my experience, and I'd love to hear Steve's perspective on that.
Well, thanks, Francois. It's an interesting, I think you covered it well. I think it's an interesting exercise. It really does is a cause for some introspection about what your goals are. If you're looking to raise a lot of capital and you're heavy on the institutional side, and you're not going to have a lot of follow-on immediate need for follow-on capital, having a heavier presence of institutional investors is probably preferable to minimize some of that potential volatility. The other end of the spectrum, can be, no liquidity at all. In our first year, I think we traded by appointment, and the stock suffered for it. So I think, if I would go back and look at those questions again, I would try to make sure we paid more attention to the mix between retail and institutional to try to strike an adequate balance. That has ways of sort of evening itself out as you expand your coverage with analysts and expand other funds that are accessible to you once you get some traction. But in the early days, it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And Steve, if I might, Scott, just piggyback on that. I think the liquidity and trading of your currency as a public company is essential. You could end up as a public company with thinly traded stock, and you're essentially a private investment for every future investor. You want to have a certain amount of liquidity so that someone can look at you and say, I like them, I want to invest in them, but I also want to be able to get my money out if I change my mind or there's a better opportunity. And if you're trading 10,000 shares a day, you're essentially a private company with all the burden of a public company. So that's to be avoided. And I think Steve spoke to, you want to have a good bank with a research analyst, hopefully in your field, and a commitment to, issue research as a covered client after the IPO. You want a good investor relations firm to maintain awareness in the market for you, because you need that trading. And for us, it's been very helpful to be well traded, because then you have a currency that you can go to other investors and say, hey, here's our business, and we're liquid.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So I think it's quite fascinating that your two backgrounds, so Francois, you're almost exclusively corporate, which I think of as being very sophisticated stakeholder relationship manager kind of skill. That's kind of what you learn, and one of the many things you learn in corporate. And Steve was, you're in larger startup kind of environments, but mostly kind of entrepreneurial kind of environment. And I'm curious what both of you think, maybe starting with Francois, about now that you're public, how does your background affect how you approach that?
Yeah, I think I started my presentation with, I think the corporate grooming and experience at good companies for a growing and developing manager, as I was in my 20s and 30s and 40s, was perfect. I think starting as in a startup has other advantages and disadvantages, but for me, I brought some skills in terms of managing a P&L. I honed my PowerPoint skills, which are essential as you prepare these thousands of presentations. But it does weigh you down with some baggage, and I think I may have brought extra risk to my equation, because Steve, as you say, was a serial entrepreneur with a range of maturity in his startups. In hindsight, I think there was a high failure rate for a guy like me coming in from GE. I had, an army of people. I had a personal assistant. I mean, it was not easy to turn all that off. There is no travel department. There is no HR department when you've got a troubled employee. There is nothing. And so I think the ability to present ideas, to analyze a market, that I honed in the corporate world, I hope. The ability to speak and communicate in a convincing, authentic way was honed in a corporate environment, and those things continue. I mean, I do a lot of public speaking, as does Steve, on our earnings calls and investor calls, and you have to have, I think, credibility. You have to know your audience, and I think those are some of the things I learned. But I would say it was probably more of a risk baggage coming from corporate world than a clear advantage. Mm-hmm. Let's hear from Steve. That interests me, to what he learned.
I think there are two attributes. We talk a lot about the success you have traveling from one experience to the other in your past. For me, there were two attributes about my past that I think were most salient to my success, and the first one is my failures. I can talk a lot more about all the failures I had because I learned a lot more from them than the highlights of my career I consider to be successful. The other attribute for me was the ability to attract real top-notch talent, and for me, the success that we were able to achieve was 100% due to pulling together the right people with the right motivation and the right timing and a bit of luck. And so that combined with learning lessons from the past, you take risks, and someone's got to stand at the front of the room and set the table. But largely our success is driven by a lot of people. We just get to stand up and talk about it.
Good. So there were a few questions relating to what sort of promises to make. This is a sort of classic conundrum in entrepreneurship, how aspirational to be, and is that different as you go pitching into IPO bankers or investors? And so this is a dangerous question. I appreciate you may want to answer somewhat obliquely, but do you have any thoughts on that? To start with Francois.
Okay, starting with me again. Yeah, I think it is a challenge to maintain the right balance of optimism that got you here, keeps you here in this challenging environment, with realistic, achievable milestones. As you speak to your bankers, about what you think you can achieve, as you speak to investors before the IPO as well as beyond, and setting those expectations. I continue to learn in that process, because I'm fairly optimistic, and I always try to be truthful about what we believe we can achieve. But sometimes, as Steve says, things take longer. And I don't like to build in, a fudge factor every time I target something. But here we are in COVID, right? We got our CE mark last year. We got it. We announced it in March. Lucky us, as the sky fell. Nobody noticed, and everything was delayed. But investors are tired of hearing, oh, it's COVID. It's true to some degree, but okay, what can you work on? What can you move forward? So you have to be honest, you have to communicate, but I remain an optimist, and sometimes I have to say, hey, we thought we'd get this done a little faster, and it's still going to happen, but it'll happen a little later than usual. Steve, any lessons for me here as I remain on the front lines that you've gleaned?
Well, it's an interesting challenge because, as you transition to public issuer, you are constrained by lots of rules and regulations. And so transparency and disclosure are always paramount. And you have to be careful because the markets can be brutal if they interpret your plans as being, achievable, and you're skating the edge. I think, as I said in one of my last slides, the markets reward consistency, and it's better to have quarter on quarter the ability to meet your milestones than to have these big home runs where you can't predict the behavior of the FDA, or you can't predict the onset of a pandemic, or your ability to pivot to building ventilators if you need to. There are a lot of unknowns, and so I think you have to be careful. I think in terms of promising, there's always wordsmithing, Scott, and your lawyer is going to look at it, or your regulatory department's going to look at it, and it's always that fine balance of trying to be ambitious but realistic and also compliant, and that's a constant tap dance that you have to navigate. You become better at it once you're on the other side of being public, because there's a lot of people who are going to help make sure you do that. In our first year, I think the Venture Exchange reviewed every press release we did before we released it. So you have a lot of help, whether you like it or not, to stay on the straight and narrow.
Amazing. So they were interesting. A couple of questions about when do you know it's not working out? I guess maybe the classic entrepreneur type question from both Christine McJanet and Alessandro Biglioli this time. So either of you have any wisdom to share with us on when to pull the plug on your venture?
Come on, let's start with Steve this time. I always go first. I want to learn from him.
It's a deeply challenging question, because there are usually so many stakeholders that are at stake, and at the same time, it's your life, it's your own commitment to try to get this, try to get it done. I was fortunate that we had enough support that even on the days where I thought we weren't going to make it, there was always someone there to say, we got this. But I think you have to be realistic, and at some point in time, you have to look at it from a sober, perspective, whether it's legal or whatever. I mean, companies have responsibilities to make sure they do the right thing. I think at the end of the day, you always have to put the company and ultimately its stakeholders and shareholders first. And when you can no longer do that, you sometimes have to figure out a different strategy. In my case, it wasn't about the company taking a break, it was about me taking a break. And after 5 years of taking the company through that chapter of its growth, I actually brought in Arun Menawat to take over the CEO role, to take the company on to $1 billion valuation, something he had achieved with his previous company. And, you do what you're supposed to do. And I think, if you're being honest with yourself, what your limits are, and you have to stay in check. I've been fortunate that most of my endeavors have had a degree of success. And when it was time to change, I didn't resist it. I tried to flow with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great question. And I don't think there is an easy answer. I mentioned in my presentation that I think I probably went beyond what was rational at times because of my ego as well as my commitment to the opportunity, but that's very dangerous. And I know, a lot of very capable, smart people with great technology who haven't made it. On the other hand, once you get into the role, I agree with Steve, it's a bit back to business. And so making those tough decisions, we are developing a new technology. This is not an iteration on something that already exists. It's really new. And you can't turn to a reference paper or ask the engineer who originated this. It's you. And sometimes you run into these, black boxes where you're like, what do we do? And you, frankly, the optimism that got you into it, I think, give you the confidence and calm to say, look, let's try this. Let's be systematic about it. Let's sleep on it and hit this again tomorrow. But in some cases, in my case, I came into ENDRA with a legacy business focused on selling high-end research equipment to academic research centers. And we had some very well-known customers using our product. Stanford University, Purdue, University of Michigan. We had several sites in Asia. And I realized once we were over the hump with the IPO that we didn't have enough money to kind of keep that business up and running and succeed in the marketplace relative to competition and develop the clinical version of this technology, which is what we've pursued. So at that point, I think your corporate hat turns on and you say, okay, what's the potential market opportunity? What's the selling cycle? What's our competitive position? And in our case, we decided we've got to, tell investors we're pivoting, we're cutting off that small revenue stream for the following reasons: long grant-driven selling cycle, not the leader in the field, and you take on the burden of, executing an end-of-life strategy with a bunch of important customers who might, by the way, become your clinical customers in a year or two. So you handle that. And so I think that kind of business portfolio decision is, from what I hear from Steve, and certainly in my experience from a corporate perspective, is perhaps easier. It's that entrepreneurial, when do you keep going, that I wish I had an answer. I don't think I have that answer, but at least I hope that gives you a bit of insight.
Scott, it reminds me of a story. I'll tell it very briefly because it's relevant, but it reminds me of a day when my VP of engineering came in and said, it doesn't work. And I said, what do you mean it doesn't work? He said, it doesn't work. It stopped working. We had gone from a Siemens 3.0, a 3 Tesla machine to a Phillips 1.5 or something like that. I forget the exact scenario. And it was on our roadmap, and we made a lot of assumptions, and the assumptions turned out to be wrong. And he said, it doesn't work. And I sensed everybody in the company was really struggling with their morale about the utter disaster we found ourselves in. And so I had movie night, and I showed the movie Apollo 13. And at the end of the movie, I took some of the props from the movie and I threw them down, and I said, let's bring them home. And I think everyone got it. It was one of those days where everyone just took a deep breath, retrenched, and then we got back to work.
And did you make it work with the lower magnetic field?
We did make it work.
Well, there you go. That was inspired. Fantastic. So there's a couple other questions. One for Francois from John Saloninka. He asked if you had chosen the RTO route. I believe you had that as there was a shell you were looking at. In retrospect, would that have been a good idea?
Yeah, we decided against that because we felt it was going to be so hard to reconcile this shell. And for those of you in the audience who may not quite understand, company who's in some form of operation or not, but has a public listing that's still active, and they may have something on the balance sheet or in the bank account, which kind of is your side door to being public. And, the legacy investors for that business, the actual operations as limited as they were on the ground, the company name and all sort of people who knew it was this other mountain we had to overcome. In our case, I don't recall, but I do believe it was a mining company in Canada. And it was just going to be so hard to reconcile that and rebrand it that we decided it wasn't the right path. But I don't think it's a wrong path. This was, once again, not the right fit for us and the people who were still involved in that company. You get to know them and you understand what their vision is and how much they want to be involved in your company or not. And so it wasn't what we ended up doing, but I loved hearing how Steve did something successfully and complex in Toronto, because obviously it's an appropriate vehicle. It just didn't work out for us.
Mm-hmm. There's a next question is about prioritizing investors. You both have pitched hundreds and hundreds of times, and probably in retrospect realized that at least half of those were probably not worth the time for either one of you. And maybe you've learned a couple things about how to match investors to the opportunities, and if you have some wisdom on that, maybe we'll let Steve talk next.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of patience, and you certainly grow a thick skin. You have to be able to understand that the risk profile or the investor profile may not be a good match. And when you're working with a bank, a lot of that work can be done up front, or at least you think it's being done up front, to screen people to better match, and at the very least give you background information on who you're meeting. And if you have a good banker, you'll have enough due diligence to understand what the potential opportunities are and who you're talking to. Even with that, you're going to get told no a lot, even by investors you think are the perfect match. I remember being with one of our directors on a trip out to California to pitch to someone whom we thought was perfect for our deal. And I learned a lot in that meeting. We had walked in thinking we were going to do a PowerPoint, and we walked into a tower where there was no walls. The entire office was all windows. There was no screen. Fortunately, I brought paper, so we had actually, had a backup plan. And into slide 3, the investor took control of the meeting and wanted to talk about, some minutia in our budget, and I lost control. And I think it was a good lesson for me to make sure you stick to your script. It's your story. Don't let your banker tell it. Don't let your board tell it. Don't let anyone else tell it. And when you find the right investors, you'll know. You'll get to have a good feeling of who you want as your investors. You don't necessarily want anyone with money in their pocket. And that can be challenging when there are desperate times. But I think if you have a good banker working with you, you can be well prepared to talk to just about any type of investor, even if they're not going to participate.
And Steve, I would echo a lot of that. In my case, the only other points I would add are, I've always tried to keep my investor meetings fairly short, so that there isn't this, okay, let's settle in, and halfway through the date, we both realize we never want to go out again. So if it's 30 minutes intro, you can do a lot of those. It's more of a volume game. It's still obviously with some focus, but you're not wasting a lot of time. And so as I come into, and I've just come out of a couple of investor conferences, and you find out that that person's really trying to sell you structured debt, which is not something we want, you can kind of agree to, respect each other's lack of interest per se, but you're not wasting a lot of time. I'd also say, secondly, that, a lot of these conversations that I had at the beginning, that 30-minute or so conversation, was a no. And as I said, with our banker and with several investors, 3, 6 months, 12 months later, they turned into a yes. They start watching you. They like your story. They're not going to invest now, but they're watching that execution you talked about, Steve. I see them. He said he was going to do this. Now you come back a year later. That to me is a very valuable investment. Planting the seeds with people, being good about follow-up. A no doesn't mean no forever. And coming back to them without much ego and saying, hey, just wanted to keep you informed of our progress. That has paid dividends. third point for me that made a difference is having your own money in the deal. And I don't mean, you know, I put $5 million in. I mean, it was substantial amount for me. It wasn't 20 bucks, but it was a substantial amount. And, you know, that's public, or you can disclose it. And people take that seriously. You're asking them to write a check. They may be a portfolio manager, or it may be their own money. But knowing you've got the deal, you've got your own money in the deal, and that skin in the game is, I think, very material. And I would say, you know, give as much as you can. Hopefully you're going to get it back because you really do believe in the company. But that makes a big difference. And being able to say that in a meeting has helped me several times.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So I think we're going to maybe wrap up with one more question. And your question is, suppose you find yourselves, I'll start with Steve here. You find yourselves in your next venture, whatever it is, it's in the medical device space. How will you decide whether it's the right venture and the right time to be public? Maybe we'll let Steve go.
Well, I think, again, it's not a unilateral decision. I've never been the founder. I've been the guy that's been privileged to take a company through a chapter of its growth. And I respect all of the stakeholders and what their goals are. Normally, when you get to a certain level of growth with either VC investors or private investors, you have to figure out what your strategy is for either an exit or growth, and how you're going to fund it. And it really is, you know, a fairly in-depth discussion to develop a view of all the pros and cons of the alternatives, and there are several. I think again, don't just think about it in terms of raising money. Think about it in terms of how it fits in with your strategic goals, because it may impact your strategy about related to partnerships. Once you become public, you may or may not become more difficult to be a partner with a certain other party, or you may be more attractive if you're public, depending on what the strategic value is. So I think you have to think of it in terms of your strategy, not just your ability to raise capital. And if you can focus on that sort of broader scope, I think it's easier to have confidence you'll make the right decision.
Great answer. Thank you, Francois. What's your take?
I don't have much more wisdom than what just Steve said, except that I think for me, the decision would be largely based on the maturity cycle of the company. That, as I said, I think we went IPO'd a little earlier than usual as a development stage company. And as I said, that distracts a lot of your attention and resources, which are so critical to bringing this product to commercial stage. So for me, until we were closer, I would probably bias my interest towards private sources, good partners in the private sector. But I also want to say I really like being public. I mean, it's something that I find that pace, the democracy of being public. You know, it's the investors and the stock market are the most efficient voting machine in the world. Sometimes you can kind of anticipate which way they're going to go. Sometimes you can't. But I love the liquidity, the transparency. I love the rigor of being public. You know, there's risk involved. You're signing your name to something that's very serious. But I also know we run a very tight ship, and that is satisfying for me. And I'm not saying that on the private side it's not done as well, but let's say there's less oversight. So that rigor for me, that liquidity, that pace is very exciting, but I would have probably done it 2 years later, but I'd still be here, I hope.
Amazing. Well, gentlemen, it has been an utter pleasure to have you on the show here today. And I hope our audience, I know we've retained a lot of audience, and there'll be hundreds of other people who watch your presentation over time. And I know it'll have a lot of impact on them. So thank you again. And for those of you in the audience, if you go to this link here, starfishmedical.com/webinars, this presentation will be loaded up on there and you can watch it later. You can also see some of our earlier content. Next month, we'll be talking about that transition from grad student all the way into successful entrepreneurship. So that should be super interesting as well. Okay.
Thanks, Scott.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure. Thank you.